Hi, Max Keiser. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to David Graeber, author of Debt, the First 5,000 Years. David, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thanks for having me.
All right, now, David Graeber, you wrote the book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. At any time during the past 5,000 years, has debt ever been, let's say, weaponized like it is now?
Pretty much continually. It's been a continual problem for 5,000 years that people who have access to the ability to make credit try to weaponize debt, basically try to enslave the rest of the population. This is the great social crisis of antiquity. If you go back to people like Aristotle, Hammurabi, Confucius, when they imagined the great social crisis, weaponized debt was what they had in mind. That this tiny percentage of the population would essentially enslave everybody else. They would start losing their flocks, their fields. Eventually they'd have to sell members of their family or even themselves into slavery. And the way I always put it, if Aristotle were alive today, he would probably see the distinction between being so deeply in debt that you have to sell yourself to work for others and being so deeply in debt that you have to rent yourself to work for others as something of a legalistic distinction.
Right. People say, well, debt's needed as a part of the economy, but what we're talking about here is fraudulent conveyance, where debt is foisted on people, like we saw the colonies in Britain, where the British would come in and do contracts with the colonists for debt that was payable before the crops came in. And then they ended up taking control of these assets.
Classic colonial technique. I mean, European powers did the same thing in India. They did it all over Africa. They essentially said, all right, well, we conquered you. You have to pay the expense of our having conquered you. So they would have taxes which they would lend them the money for in such a way that they would end up necessarily deeply in debt. It was all completely calculated.
The same thing with Greece, though, right? Greece?
Absolutely.
Now they're moving in to take the assets.
Absolutely. And almost all of that was military debt. I mean, the reason why Greece is so in debt is it's the most militarized society in Europe. I mean, I always say, like, if they were really serious, they could just repossess their battleships. But nobody's even talking about that.
But no one talks about the military spend in Greece, as a matter of fact. And all the reports that we read, they rarely mention the fact that they, despite the austerity, they're still spending a lot.
Enormous amounts on the military. In fact, Turkey actually offered Greece a mutual 20% military cut as a way of undercutting the Greek debt, as a gesture of friendship, and Greece refused.
David Graeber, student loan debt has passed total outstanding credit card debt. Your thoughts?
Well, it's pretty much amazing. This is $1 trillion worth of debt. And just to put that into perspective, consider that all tuition that is paid in America, if you added the whole thing up, it would come to $70 billion. So now we're up to $1,000 billion. It's actually owed in debt. And that shows you what kind of interest people are paying here. It's also an interesting insight because if the government wanted to make tuition free for everyone in America, it would cost less than the Bush tax cuts.
Right, and it's also, there's a self-feeding phenomenon in that their debt is easy to get, so it actually drives the cost of education higher, and
Absolutely.
This increases the debt burden, and so it's a self-feeding phenomenon, isn't it?
The terrible self-defeating phenomenon, but it's also combined with the fact that you need certificates for more and more things. So you need a degree to do things that you never needed a degree to do before. Basically, at this point in America, if you want to have a job that gives you health benefits, for example, you pretty much have to have a degree. And chances are, increasingly, you have to have an MA in most disciplines. So that debt is basically the cost that you're paying for having any kind of secure life in the future.
And in the UK, it's even worse, isn't it?
It's terrible in the UK. And in the UK, well, what's fascinating about the UK, as you can see, it was totally calculated. I was there when they issued the Brown Report, which is a classic sort of neoliberal document where they say, well, of course, nobody would ever want an education except to further their future life income. They just assume that everybody is a selfish, greedy bastard like themselves and isn't actually interested in education. Understanding of the world, who cares? I just want more money. Now, of course, this is what really offended students in the student movement the most. Every single occupation began by saying, no, education is a value unto itself. We're doing this because we love it. But here's the interesting thing. What they then did was they tripled tuition and they made everybody effectively take out student loans, which effectively forced people to act like those sort of calculating, greedy people they had originally imagined them to be.
Now, it's funny, in the UK, of course, it started off with this notion of a top-up fee, which sounded so innocuous, and then it grew from there, right?
Exactly. Well, I mean, the fascinating thing is the complete betrayal of the political class, because the liberal Democratic Party that essentially was responsible for putting this through ran on a platform of eliminating the student fees that did exist. They said, we're going to, and they signed a pledge, a solemn promise, that they would never raise tuition fees. Of course, the moment they came in, they tripled them. They collectively broke their promise. And which is why I always point out, think about this. A debt, what is a debt anyway? A debt is just a promise. Why is a debt to bankers held to be absolutely sacred? And this is what they said, well, we owe all this money, we can't actually do this. But that debt is sacred. A debt made to the public isn't sacred. Why not?
Well, the debts between the bankers are abrogated all day long. But
absolutely.
To the public, they're sacred.
Exactly. One of the things that I discovered, and this is one of the things that really came through if you look at the history of debt, is that rich people can be astoundingly understanding, forgiving, kind, when dealing with each other. It's just when you owe a debt to them, suddenly it becomes this sacred thing that no one would possibly think of abrogating.
Right. Now, this is a question/thought, exercise. The Social Security so-called trustees claim this week that the fund will go bankrupt soon. You talk in your book about fiat currencies and commodity currencies. Mm-hmm. If we live in a fiat system as we do today, how can the government fund go bankrupt?
It can't. There's absolutely no way. They're essentially lying to us about the nature of the money system that we now have. And in 2008, we figured that out. Trillions of dollars of debt can be made to vanish. Trillions of dollars can be just produced out of a hat if they want to do so. Again, it's a question of who's actually doing the asking. They could have easily bailed out the banks simply by printing the same money that they printed and giving it to mortgage holders. They chose instead to give it directly to the banks. They could just as easily print these enormous amounts of money that they're printing and use it for all sorts of social purposes. They could, as I say, they could easily pay everyone's tuition in America, and it would hardly make a dent in their budget. Instead, they seem to want people to be in debt.
All right, now in terms of history of debt and money, the past 30 years, only time when we've seen 100% fiat currency backed by just more debt. The post-1971 Nixon gold window closing. Now, fiat currencies weren't they usually backed before this by gold or something?
There was ultimately something backing them up. They were credit systems rather than fiat systems for the most part. Even the Chinese system, occasionally it turned into something you could call a fiat currency, but essentially these were credit instruments that people used with each other that governments then adopted.
Interesting, in the book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, it really starts off with this conversation of which came first, the debt or the credit, I would say, is, and this opens up an interesting debate, and I think it needs to be talked about a little bit there. Can you run us through this?
Well, you see, we're all taught this little fairy tale, and everybody seems to believe it, that, once upon a time there was barter. And that became inconvenient because, people used to sit around saying, tell you what, I'll give you 20 chickens for that cow. Not 20, 30 chickens? And, you kind of come to a deal. Everybody's doing spot trade. And eventually there's all sorts of problems. Maybe I don't want chickens, you don't have anything I want, we got to walk home. So you make up money, and then eventually credit comes out of that. The problem with this, of course, is it assumes that a bunch of Neolithic villagers are going to be dealing with a spot trade, which is kind of insane. If I don't need this guy's chickens, he's my neighbor. I'm going to need something he's got eventually. So what would actually happen is kind of a credit system. But it'd be kind of rough and ready credit system. I give you a cow, you owe me something kind of like a cow, so maybe I come back and ask for a pig, or maybe I explain that my son is in love with your daughter. It's a social thing. The question is how that turns into something you can precisely quantify, like 27 of these equals 57 of those. And that seems to actually not happen through trade at all, but through law. It's when people are really angry that they get very specific. We get into a fight and you cut off my ear, or my eye has popped out, or something like that. Then it's always 27 heifers, and that's exactly right. Exactly what it says, or this means war. And if you don't have 27 heifers, then we got to substitute. So there's always, when there's a tinge of at least potential violence there, that people start getting really specific about the numbers.
Right, and the specificity for quantitative units of money always associated with damage and eventually wars. Before that, you mentioned that essentially credit or money was a system where it was very common, in the ancient world anyway, to say, well, let me have that chicken, I'll pay you later.
Yeah, you don't even say that. You say, oh, take the chicken, it's a present, don't even think about giving me anything back. Of course, everybody knows really you owe me.
But it's a credit.
Yeah, it's a credit. But
so it's like a
important.
Wimpy in the Popeye series.
Exactly.
Give me a hamburger today, and I'll pay you on Tuesday.
Yeah.
But Wimpy was alive 5,000 years ago, essentially.
Precisely. That's the way things
work. At the Brontosaurus Burger Market.
Yeah, and it's all caught up in, friendships and enemies, and everybody has strong personal feelings about each other, and, maybe I don't... maybe I want to give you something that you can't pay back, because then you'll be really embarrassed, and every time you see me, you'll be like...
Right, well, I would imagine all these overlapping credits and obligations then become the social fabric.
Precisely.
And lead to institutions like religion and other institutions grow up around this idea, this network of obligations.
And often it's felt everybody should be in debt with each other. That's good, but just a little. So if you give me a present, I'll give you something else that's worth a little bit more or a little bit less. But if I give you something exactly the same, it's like saying, well, I don't really want to have anything to do with you anymore.
Right, you're zero-summing it out.
Yeah.
And it's very cold.
Exactly.
There's no okay. Let me ask you this. You've been involved with Occupy Wall Street. Debt and student debt are big issues in the Occupy movement. How do you think Occupy is done as a movement? Successes, what do you consider a success? Where does it go from here?
Well, we're ready for our spring offensive, and it's going to be big. I can assure you it'll be a lot of interesting things starting to happen, because what's happened is we've diversified. We have a slogan. I'm not sure I can say it on television. Well, I can say the Baudelaire's version of "Screw us and we multiply," and this is pretty much what's happened. We got kicked out of the parks, but in the meantime, the number of different initiatives on every level, from housing stuff to Occupy Farms. We have 11 occupied farms in New York alone. We have projects on debt. We have projects on art. We're all over the place. So we're going to just show up on 1,000 fronts at once very soon.
It's interesting that May Day, as such, has never existed in the United States. There's Labor Day.
Labor Day was created to be as far as possible in the year over from May Day, yes.
So talk a little bit about the fact that now we are entering a real May Day.
Real Day. And the amazing thing, this is celebrated all over the world, but it's a celebration of something that happened in Chicago. Everybody in the world has been celebrating an event that happened in Chicago that nobody in actual Chicago even knows about anymore.
Yeah, well, tell us about it.
Yeah, well, it was the fight for the 8-hour day, which was led by anarchists. Traditionally, anarchists tend to be the guys pushing for less hours. It's usually the Marxists who want more money in terms of labor unions in the 19th century. So there's a great deal of anarchist mobilization around the 8-hour day, and a lot of police repression, and at some point, nobody's quite sure how, somebody threw a bomb. A bunch of cops were killed and injured. And what they essentially did is they rounded up all the most outspoken anarchists, had a show trial, and had them all executed. And that was the Haymarket riots. This event, and it was an obvious kangaroo court. These people clearly had nothing to do with the incident, if it indeed was an anarchist at all. This became a cause célèbre and has been honored by people as far away as India, Bolivia, China, to celebrate something that happened in Chicago in the 1880s.
David Graeber, we're out of time. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
It's great to be here.
That's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank my guest, David Graeber, author of Debt, The First 5,000 Years. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.